So without further ado, I just want to let you know quickly that this is our plan for the next hour. We will briefly cover a couple of important employment laws as well as healthcare laws before we move into laws that directly impact education. And then we will get to the main event, which is the Education Transformation Bill. So that's our plan for today. As I said, please be patient. We'll take your questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you now to Sue Siglowski, the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association. Sue.
Thank you very much for that introductory information, Debbie. I'm Sue Siglowski. I'm the Executive Director for the Vermont School Boards Association, and we're pleased to offer this webinar to school board members and superintendents, giving an overview of the bills that passed during the 2025 legislative session. With us today is Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Hi, everyone.
And we know everyone wants to know more about H454, the Education Transformation Bill. So we are going to, as Debbie said, cover the other bills rather quickly first so that we can spend most of the time on H454. We're going to talk about employment legislation, which affects schools as employers, and healthcare legislation, which affects schools in that health insurance, as you all know, is a benefit to employees and a major cost driver in school budgets. And then we're going to move on to the education-specific legislation that passed this year, including H454. We're not going to have time to cover every single detail in these bills, but I am happy to let you know that our legislative report was emailed to all members this morning, and that has much more detail than this presentation. Typically, employment legislation affects education, as schools are major employers in their communities. Act 40 removes the authority of the Commissioner of Labor to recommend a subminimum wage for individuals with disabilities, learners, and apprentices, and provides claimants and employers with the option to receive communication about unemployment insurance claims electronically. Act 40 also allows workers' compensation claimants to request medical case management services, and for claimants who do not speak English fluently, to receive translation services. It provides enhanced penalties for the late payment of weekly benefits to workers' compensation claimants. And the other act that passed, Act 32, expands the definition of a family member in Vermont's Parental and Family Leave Act. This provides individuals in non-traditional family structures with equal access to caregiving leave. The Act also expands the definition of parental leave to include an employee's recovery from childbirth or miscarriage or to care for a foster child. Act 32 permits eligible employees to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid job-protected leave annually for safe leave if an employee or an employee's family member is a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. The Act also permits eligible employees to use up to 2 weeks for bereavement leave with no more than 5 workdays to be taken consecutively. And finally, Act 32 permits covered employees to take qualified exigency leave related to active duty service by a family member in the U.S. Armed Forces. And you can find more information about these new employment laws in the legislative report. We'll move on now to healthcare legislation. VSBA prioritized addressing healthcare as a cost driver in education during this legislative session. In accordance with that priority, we supported H266, a bill capping hospital charges for outpatient prescription drugs. VSBA members may remember receiving an action alert on this bill. We are pleased to report that H266 passed both the House and the Senate and was signed by the governor last week. And according to estimates, H266 will slow the increase of VHI's bill premium by about 3%. And that should decrease pressure on school district budgets. We understand that there's many pressures on school district budgets. S-126, enacted as Act 68, authorizes reference-based pricing by FY 2027, capping hospital charges based on Medicare or other benchmarks. The passage of these two bills represents significant progress, and there's much more work to be done to address healthcare as a cost driver in education. VSBA is committed to continuing its advocacy in this area, as well as addressing other education cost drivers such as mental health and facilities. We're moving on now to education-specific legislation. And we'll start with Act 53. This is a law which updates language that allows designated personnel to administer epinephrine consistent with a healthcare provider's standing order or protocol. Previously, the law referred to auto-injectors. This term has been removed from the law and replaced with epinephrine delivery system containing a pre-measured single dose of epinephrine. This update to the law will allow the administration of intranasal epinephrine, which is used to respond to severe allergic reactions called anaphylaxis. Additionally, Act 53 permits schools to maintain a stock supply of epinephrine and enter into agreements to acquire it at fair market or reduced prices. The Act authorizes trained school staff to administer epinephrine not only to students with prescribed plans, but also to any individual experiencing anaphylaxis, regardless of prescription status.
Hi, everyone. We'll move on now to to H480, which is the miscellaneous education bill, which contains many sections related to education. Several of which are related to school safety issues. The first is in 2023, Act 29, a school safety bill, was passed that required the AOE to issue a behavioral threat assessment team model policy by December 15th, 2023, and for school boards to adopt that policy by July 1, 2025. The AOE was quite late in issuing that model policy, so the VSBA and VSA worked with the AOE and legislators to extend the deadline for school boards to adopt the model policy. That new deadline is October 1st, 2025. The bill also shifts the responsibility of administrative procedures to the superintendent in alignment with roles and responsibilities. That's a common theme lately, is that the legislature has passed laws that assigns responsibility of procedures to school boards, where in reality, we know that administrative procedures are the responsibility of superintendents and school board policies the responsibility of boards. So we've been trying to correct some of those errors in law and have done that in two instances in this particular bill. The procedures will also be adopted by October 1, 2025. The redraft of the model policy is on VSBA's website, and it has been linked in recent weekly updates. The next piece of school safety related law in this act is the requirement of the Vermont School Safety Center to maintain a template which will include at minimum hazard-specific provisions for acute cardiac events in schools, including protocols that address AEDs. School districts and independent schools must have a cardiac emergency response plan in accordance with the template from Vermont School Safety Center, ready for implementation beginning in the 2026-2027 school year. The next provisions in 480 are some small changes to the law, one being that the H480 charges the AOE with maintaining access to and oversight of virtual learning provider in order to offer virtual learning opportunities to Vermont students. This is something that happened in COVID and is codifying it in law. To enroll in this virtual learning, the student must be enrolled in the public school. Virtual learning must be determined to be an appropriate, flexible pathway, and the student's learning experience must occur under the supervision of an appropriately licensed educator. If those criteria are met, the school district that has the student that attends virtual learning still will be able to count the student towards this district's average daily membership. The next change related to BOCES is a small change to a law that allowed for the establishment of BOCES that was passed last year. And it simply moves the allowance of when the grant is received to before you begin working on your articles of agreement. So you can, even with just the interest of exploring BOCES by several school districts or supervisory unions, can apply for that grant ahead of doing any of the legwork on making that come to fruition. That was something that we asked for fairly early in the session, so happy to see that pass. The next provision is around the appointment of a Secretary of Education. We all know how long it took to appoint the last Secretary of Education. I believe this is in response to that phenomenon, and basically sets a timeline in law in which the initiation and appointment of a Secretary of Education needs to take place. Next, Act 139 of 2024 mandated early literacy screening requirements for kindergarten through third grade. In that process, they, I think unintentionally, but regardless, they stripped the language about supplemental reading instruction to only include K through 3 students. The new language keeps the provisions of Act 139 as a K through 3 law as it pertains to early screening, but it does revert the supplemental reading instruction language back to K through 12 students for students significantly below proficiency. I think it's something that most or all school districts do. You provide supplemental instruction for any students who struggle, not just for those in K through 3. So that's simply the change to revert back to that language and recognize that supplemental instruction happens beyond third grade. Next is another one of those tweaks that I talked about a little while ago in the school library material selection policy and procedure that was required under Act 150 of 2024. It shifts the responsibility for adoption of school library material procedures from school boards to superintendents. The policy is up on the Vermont School Boards Association website. And I also have model procedures that have been vetted by attorneys that I will share with superintendents in the very near future. Many of you already have them, but these particular procedures and the policy have been vetted to align with the new law. The next provisions, Section 11, addresses tuition benefits for Vermont National Guard. I won't go into too much detail or no detail at all on that one. And Section 16, many of you know about the moratorium on the formation or acceptance of new approved independent schools. And this particular provision exempts the therapeutic independent schools that are changing tax status. It's based on a singular independent school in Vermont who is currently a for-profit status that wants to transfer to a nonprofit and doesn't want to have to go through the approval process to become an approved independent school again. And so this exempts anyone that changes tax status around approved independent school status.
We'll now move on to student use of phones and social media, Section 17 and 18 of the Miscellaneous Education Bill. This section adds new requirements to provide all Vermont students a phone and social media-free school environment at all public schools, approved independent schools, and career and technical education centers in Vermont. The requirements are that first, the Secretary of Education must develop a model policy prohibiting student use of cell phones and personal electronic devices at school, by January 1st, 2026. In developing the model policy, the Secretary must consult with the VSBA, the Vermont Independent Schools Association, and a representative from the Vermont Coalition for Phone and Social Media Free Schools. School boards must adopt the policy on or before July 1, 2026. The model policy will prohibit student use of cell phones and non-school issued personal electronic devices at school from arrival to dismissal. Exceptions will be outlined in the model policy and will include use by students who use a cell phone or personal electronic device as required as part of their individualized healthcare plan, individualized education program, or 504 plan, or approved by an administrator for an academic, school-sponsored athletic, or co-curricular purpose for the most limited use reasonably possible, or required for compliance with the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act.
All right, still on 480 here. The last provision that we'll cover pertains to CTE. This allows students to attend CTE centers outside of their designated region. If their local center doesn't offer their desired program, they are waitlisted or denied entry. The sending district will pay tuition for enrollment via an agreement between the sending district and the receiving district that specifies how costs for such enrollments shall be covered. The regional CTE center may provide transportation to those students residing outside of the region and does require sharing of student information to support program awareness when local CTE access is limited. I believe this is already permitted, but it is codified in law now through this miscellaneous education bill.
Okay, moving on from the miscellaneous education bill to the yield bill. This is a bill that is passed every year by the legislature, and it sets Vermont's education property tax parameters for the next fiscal year, which in this case is FY26. So it sets the property dollar equivalent yield, the income dollar equivalent yield, and the non-homestead property tax rate. Of note and important for school boards and superintendents to know is that the highlighted information on this slide, that the yield bill is this year utilized a one-time general fund transfer of $77.2 million and $41 million of education fund surplus to buy down the average property tax bill in FY26. And what this means is that there is an estimated average bill increase of 1.1% for non-homestead and homestead properties. The buy down of tax bills in FY26 will create a $118.2 million hole in the education fund, thereby impacting school district budgets in FY27.
Sue, can I jump in on one thing related to the yield bill?
Yes.
You'll notice that the property dollar equivalent yield is lower than typical years. I just want to remind folks that that was because of the statewide adjustment of the CLA that makes it appear much lower. Next is what they call the big bill. It's the Fiscal Year Appropriations Act. I won't go into too much detail. The bill aims to address many of the ongoing challenges Vermont faces. As Sue mentioned, there's a $77.2 million drawdown for property tax relief to the education fund from the general fund, and it also sets aside $4 million to support education transformation via funding for contracts and permanent positions to the Agency of Education.
Okay, moving on now to Act 51, which made several changes to Vermont's open meeting law that are important for all of us to understand. Those changes are, first, clarifying the definition of undue hardship. Undue hardship is the standard for exempting municipalities, including school districts, from complying with the requirement to record meetings and post a copy of the recording. So there's that definition has been refined. Second, removing the term non-advisory public body throughout the open meeting law and instead utilizing the term public body to refer to those entities, including school boards. The law continues to utilize the term advisory body for public bodies such as school board committees that do not have supervision, control, or jurisdiction over legislative, quasi-judicial, tax, or budgetary matters. And hopefully that change will make the law a little bit clearer. It was a little bit confusing to have that term in there, non-advisory. Third, changing the time frame for posting an audio or video recording from 30 days following the approval and posting of the official minutes of the meeting to 30 days following the posting of the minutes of a meeting. Also, specifying that the recording requirement does not apply to site inspections or field visits. Fourth, expanding the posting location of municipal public body notice of a special meeting to include neighboring municipality. And fifth, requiring a meeting agenda to contain sufficient details concerning the specific matters to be discussed by the public body and requiring that whenever a public body includes an executive session as an item on a posted meeting agenda, the public body must list the agenda item as proposed executive session and indicate the nature of the business of the executive session. There are also amendments to the executive session section of the open meeting law, adding a requirement to conclude executive session by majority vote for all public bodies except a state governmental public body, which requires 2/3 of its members. And adding to the permissible topics for executive session, cybersecurity response measures, the disclosure of which could jeopardize public safety. And lastly, Act 51 also amends Vermont's criminal law on disorderly conduct by defining what constitutes disorderly conduct in the context of disturbance at public meetings. And it defines that conduct as that which causes a meeting to terminate prematurely or consists of numerous and sustained efforts to disrupt a meeting after being asked to desist. Act 51, the changes to the open meeting law, went into effect upon passage. We're moving on now to housing and housing development. There are two pieces of Act 69, which was a housing bill that school board members and superintendents should know about. First, it will allow municipalities and developers to borrow money for infrastructure for a housing project and then use the increased property tax revenue from the homes to help pay back the debt, thereby diverting the increased property tax revenue from the education fund. Secondly, the Act expands protections under Vermont's Public Accommodations Act by adding two protected classes, which are citizenship and immigration status. This change will require updates to some VSBA model policies and, of course, updates to your school board policies. The VSBA model policy updates will happen over the summer. Please be sure to check the VSBA's weekly emails issued each Tuesday for more information on the model policy updates. We are now going to move on to H454, the bill that extended the legislative session and aims to transform Vermont's education governance, quality, and finance systems. And H454 begins by changing the role of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. As originally designed last year, the result of the Commission's work was supposed to be a recommendation for a statewide vision for Vermont's public education system, with recommendations for the policy changes that would be necessary to make Vermont's educational vision a reality. The original charge of the commission reflected the visionary focus of its work. H454 reduces the charge to the following. First, recommendations for what roles, functions, or decisions should be a function of local control and what roles, functions, or decisions should be a function of state level control. Second, necessary updates to the roles and responsibilities of school district boards and the electorate. Third, a process for a community served by a school to have a voice in decisions regarding school closures and recommendations for what that process should entail. And fourth, a process for monitoring the implementation of H454 in a manner that is transparent and public facing.
Next is the redistricting task force. The charge of this task force is to recommend new school district boundaries and configurations to the General Assembly. The makeup of the task force and parameters include legislators will hold the majority vote. The House, Senate, and Governor will appoint 5 members who are former education leaders, 2 members appointed by the Speaker of the House. 1 must be a retired or former Vermont superintendent of a supervisory union with multiple member school districts, and 1 must be either a retired or former Vermont school business manager or a retired or former school board member. 2 members appointed by the Committee on Committees, that's over on the Senate side. 1 must be a retired or former Vermont superintendent, and 1 must be a retired or former Vermont school business manager. And then 1 member appointed by the governor, who must be a retired or former Vermont superintendent. 6 members will be appointed by the legislature, 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate. Members cannot all be from the same political party or the same school district. The task force must propose not more than 3 options for new school district boundaries. At least 1 option must include the use of supervisory unions and allow for the continuation of a tuitioning system that provides continued access to independent schools. And then finally, or next to finally, proposed new school districts or supervisory unions and supervisory districts must have, to the extent practical, an average daily membership of not fewer than approximately 4,000 students and not more than 8,000 students. I'd like to just emphasize that VSBA and VSA were very opposed to the minimum of 4,000 students and instead recommended school district sizes that were based in research and that were proven to be more efficient and effective for student learning outcomes. We did not advocate for the 4,000 student minimums at either of our association. The task force must hold at least 2 public hearings and work with the Commission on the Future of Public Education's public engagement process. That report and the maps are due December 1, 2025. Where the General Assembly will then begin debating in early January when they return on adopting a map.
The School District Voting Ward Working Group is tasked with creating voting wards within the new school districts to ensure school board membership is apportioned to achieve substantially equal weighting of the votes of all voters in the choice of school board members. The composition of the working group is the Secretary of State as chair, 3 members appointed by the Vermont Municipal Clerk Treasurer Association, 2 members appointed by the Vermont School Boards Association, and the director of the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. Using the boundary proposals of the task force that Chelsea just outlined, this working group must use the same principles of apportionment that are followed by the Legislative Apportionment Board to make recommendations to the legislature for voting districts within each school district that are compact, contiguous, and drawn to achieve substantially equal weighting of votes, and that meet the requirements of state and federal law. The working group's recommendations must include, first, the optimal number of school board members per school board to maximize public representation and democratic input while maintaining effective school board size. And second, boundaries for school district voting wards within each school district with alternative options if necessary, including detailed maps clearly delineating ward boundaries that respect current municipal boundary lines. And the working group ceases to exist on June 30th, 2026.
Next, we have class size minimum requirements. H454 sets these minimums at grade 1 would be 10 students. Grades 2 to 5, a minimum average class size of 12 students. Grades 6 through 8 in required content areas is 15 students, and grades 9 through 12 in required content areas, the minimum average class size is 18 students. Multi-age classrooms for K through 8 are limited to 2 grade levels per classroom. Something that is important to note are there are exceptions to these class size minimums, including pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, career and technical ed, flexible pathways, terminal courses, advanced placement courses, courses requiring specialized equipment, driver's education, and small group services for special education, supplemental or targeted academic intervention, or English learner instruction. Something else that is important to note is that there is an extensive waiver process if a school board determines that it operates a school that is unable to comply with the class size minimum standards due to geographic isolation, or a school has developed an implementation plan to meet the standards that may include consolidation or merger. The school board may ask the State Board of Education to grant a waiver. The state board must define what qualifies as geographic isolation, and the secretary may take action on those school districts not meeting the class size minimums for, and this is important, over the course of 3 consecutive school years. Next is some statewide standards, calendars, and systems. Statewide graduation standards will be due to the State Board of Education, or due by the State Board of Education by January 1st, 2026. The statewide calendar begins 2028 and 2029. That is going to be developed by the Agency of Education in consultation with the field. And then it also requires the AOE to provide guidance basically on how to make any potential district consolidation or merger processes happen. As many of you know, it is an incredibly complex process that requires merging of data systems, asset and liability transfers, collective bargaining agreement reconciliations, and how they'll also have to describe how the AOE will support that consolidation process. Next is a pretty easy one. They created a school construction aid program, but there is no funding. So we will not go into detail on that until statewide funding becomes available.
Okay, moving on to tuition to independent schools and tuition transition. The bill creates new requirements for tuition to approved independent schools that are effective July 1, 2025. And as of that date, tuition to approved independent schools is limited to those that are, first of all, they need to be located in Vermont. Next, approved on or before July 1, 2025. Next requirement is they need to be located within either a supervisory district that does not operate a public school for some or all grades as of July 1, 2024, or a supervisory union with one or more member school districts that does not operate a public school for some or all grades as of July 1, 2024. Additionally,
sorry, so I got the question about public schools outside of Vermont. Can you address that?
yes, it continues to allow tuition to public schools outside of Vermont.
Thank you.
Additionally, to qualify for public tuition, an approved independent school must have had at least 25% of its student enrollment composed of students attending on a district-funded tuition basis during the 2023-2024 school year and must comply with minimum class size requirements And if a school is unable to comply with minimum class size requirements due to geographic isolation or has developed an implementation plan to meet the requirement, then the school may ask the state board to grant it a waiver. So that is the list of requirements for tuition, and they're laid out, and all the detail that I just spoke about is in the legislative report, which you should have received this morning. Wanted to also let you know that there is a provision requiring school districts to continue to pay tuition on behalf of students enrolled for the 2024-2025 school year, or who have been accepted for enrollment for the 2025-2026 school year by approved independent schools until such time as those students graduate from those schools. And we'll move on to state board appointments. The bill moves the 10-person board from sole appointment by the governor to one member appointed by the House and one by the Senate without expanding the board. And that is effective July 1, 2025. Next, tuition calculation. The provisions on tuition calculation take effect on July 1, 2028, under various contingencies, including that the new school districts approved by the legislature in 2026 have assumed responsibility for the education of all resident students. This section sets tuition for receiving schools at the foundation base amount, and Chelsea will talk in a couple slides about the foundation. So it's the foundation base amount multiplied by the sum of 1 and any weights for each student who is attending the school, except that the receiving school may charge 5% more on the base for each student in grades 9 through 12, as long as the school has received approval from the state board and the electorate of each sending district with at least one student attending the receiving school approves supplemental spending for that purpose. A receiving school that elects and is eligible to charge an additional fee must charge the same additional fee for each student attending on a publicly funded basis. A receiving school is prohibited from charging different fees to different school districts. Additionally, sending districts are required to pay the full tuition charged by independent schools in Vermont that operate as approved area career and technical centers with no cap or limitation.
Next is related to special education studies. The General Assembly recognized that there are considerable elements of special education that need to be examined in education transformation, but they really did kind of punt those decisions to a later date. They asked for a report on the cost, growth, and delivery of special education. Specifically, they asked the Agency of Education, or a contractor with the Agency of Education, to investigate the growing extraordinary costs and that is a technical term, not just a term, not just an adjective, and evaluation of Act 173 and its implementation. They also tasked the Agency of Education with coming up with a strategic plan related to special education due December 1, 2025, covering many of the topics related to the study as well. I want to note here that there is also a need to investigate whether disability category weights, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, is the right way to fund special education. I will say that our association and the VCSEA, the Special Ed Administrator Association, have significant concerns about the way that they are proposing to fund special education through weights in this formula.
Next, we'll move to the AOE transformation appropriation, and that is the sum of $2,865,000 from the general fund to the Agency of Education in fiscal year 2026 to support education transformation work, with $200,000 allocated to support school boards transitioning to new governance models, $562,500 allocated for additional positions at the agency, and $2,102,500 for contracted services to the agency to support school districts with administrative activities related to consolidation. And those could include accounting, budget, operational practices, and support on education quality activities like alignment of curriculum, instructional materials, and teaching activities.
Next is a big one. The H454 transitions to a foundation formula. This is contingent on new school districts assuming responsibility for the education of all resident students with the following parameters. The base amount is $15,033 adjusted for inflation annually by the Secretary of Education. I'll note that I don't believe that that is indicative of the high healthcare costs that are in Vermont, and so we'll continue to advocate for an inflation factor that more accurately represents the increases to healthcare that we experience in Vermont. The special education is funded through weighted categorization of disabilities. There's 3 categories and they all hold different weights. Again, I wanted to point out that that is an area of significant concern to superintendents and special ed administrators. And we've asked legislators to look more carefully at what it would look like for the funding formula to match the actual cost of services rather than categorization of disabilities. You can imagine that a student with a certain disability, different students with the same disability require very different services in some instances. English language learners are funded through weighted categorization of proficiency levels and a newcomer weight. It sets a weight for economic disadvantage at 1.02, my apologies. Sets a small school grant for schools under 100 students and deems small by necessity, which is going to be determined by the State Board of Education. Sets a sparse schools grant for schools in cities or towns with fewer than 55 people per square mile and deems sparse by necessity by the State Board of Education. Requires the Agency of Education to develop a plan for education transportation reimbursement grants. I believe those are supposed to cover the full cost of transportation for school districts, and creates a transition that softens the impact of increased taxes or decreased education funding over the course of 4 years from fiscal year 2029 to fiscal year 2032. And that's a graduated transition. The one last thing about the foundation formula that I want to mention is that this modeling is based on work from Professor Tammy Colby at the Agency of Education. It is reflective of the current realities of educating Vermont students. And if things change throughout this process, then modeling really needs to take place again, as the assumptions that arrived at these basin weights will have changed. So the inputs to arrive at the 15,000 base and the weights we would presume would have changed if we change, for example, districts, class size, and other factors related to what was input to the foundation formula. Oh, sorry. The next piece is around supplemental spending. This is a phased cap beginning in 2029, fiscal year 2029, at 10% to start with, and it eventually moves to a 5% cap on supplemental spending by 2038 and beyond. And then the property tax mechanism is based on property values in the district that is voting for supplemental spending. The higher the property values, the greater local tax input to get the supplemental spending. That increased tax revenue is put into a fund to buy down taxes. That's it for that slide, Debbie.
Okay, on to homestead and property tax reform. H454 replaces the current statewide education property tax credit with a homestead property tax exemption based on income. Homeowners with an annual household income of $115,000 or less will be allowed to exempt a portion of their house site value, up to $425,000, from property taxes. Additionally, the section includes a study examining whether to increase the income eligibility threshold. The bill also divides the non-homestead tax category into residential and non-residential. A new property tax classification, non-homestead residential, is meant to ensure that second homes are taxed at a higher rate than businesses and apartment rentals. That section takes effect on July 1, 2028, provided that the new school districts approved by the legislature in 2026 have assumed responsibility for the education of all resident students, and that the study to reevaluate the factors of the foundation formula has been completed. H454 also establishes 12 regional assessment districts that will jointly reappraise their grand lists every 6 years, effective January 1, 2029. Each county constitutes one regional assessment district, except that Franklin and Grand Isle counties together constitute one district, and Essex and Orleans counties together constitute one district.
All right, we're coming to a close. That's a lot of pages of legislation that we just covered. The implementation timeline is full of contingencies and studies and what ifs. The studies and task forces begin almost immediately, and the foundation formula implementation is contingent upon the legislature adopting a map next year. So if they are not able to agree on a new map as it is currently written, nothing else, or the big provision of the foundation formula, will not go into place. So that is going to be a big thing to watch in the next half of the biennium. If the districts are in place for operation by July 1, 2028, then the foundation formula will go into effect with the transition mechanism. Let's pull up these questions.
So we have a number of questions that popped in. I think we should take them in chronological order. So the first one came in at 12:23, and I think it goes to the slide, Sue, about the open meeting law changes. The question is, can a shared link to a community access TV website for videos posted meet the requirement, or do districts need to post the video themselves?
I believe that a shared link is now acceptable, but we will double check that and send the information out with other materials that go out after this webinar.
Great.
Don't know what that next one means, Debbie.
I don't either. So I'm going to skip over that. If they, I'm going to go to this one. Has anyone thought about the cost of transportation for some schools who would have to travel over 2 hours daily if redistricted? I don't feel that this would be fiscally responsible.
I don't think we have any conclusive evidence of what the districts are going to look like, what the transportation times are going to look like, in which schools are going to be in operation. The bill is silent on which schools are still in operation. The only provision in the bill related to school size is class size minimums. And so I think it's preemptive to assume transportation times, though I do know that the Agency of Education is tasked with investigating the cost of transportation in order to establish a transportation reimbursement grant.
Thanks, Chelsea. Here's a question that I had at one point. It's a good one. Question on the class size minimums. For schools that are operating multi-age classrooms, is it the average for the whole classroom, combined first and second grade, or do both grades need to meet the standard, i.e. enough for the first graders and enough for the second graders?
My understanding is it's the combined
It's the combined.
multi-age classroom.
Okay.
I would
Um,
anticipate that there will be or should be guidance from the Agency of Education related to the implementation of this, or something from the state board, since they're the ones that are going to be dealing with the waiver process.
Sounds good. How will the class size minimums be calculated in practice for multi-age classrooms? For example, if there's a combined 1-2 class of 5 first graders and 7 second graders, is this class in compliance with the class size minimum? Again, I think it goes back to the guidance that we'll need. Yeah.
Yeah.
Regarding CTE, any ideas about how transportation would be handled for CTE?
They really punted most CTE decisions to the next half of the biennium, including funding, transportation, delivery, governance, all of the things.
Yeah, the next question had to do with transportation as well, regarding CTE. So that's to be continued. Oh, so did somebody mention a change of governance model? And if so, what would that be? Trying to remember.
I don't know that anyone mentioned change of governance model, but of course, if there are changes to the boundaries of districts or supervisory unions, that would possibly change the number of school board members that would be part of that governance model. But that's all to be determined in the next legislative session, the size of the districts and or supervisory unions, and that the district ward working group that I spoke about is going to be considering the sort of the optimal size of school boards.
Thanks, Sue. Here's a question regarding small schools. They're said to be defined as classes of less than 20. If the size is now under 100, how does that include pre-K to 12 schools with classes of less than 20? I'm not sure I understand that. Small schools are
I'm not
said
sure
to
I
be
do
defined.
either.
Do the small schools definition have anything about class size? Are those two separate?
Those are two separate things.
Mhm.
And small schools is only defined based on the grant in the foundation formula.
Okay. So that's the only time that
I,
definition is
yes, and I
needed.
believe it doesn't matter the grade configuration. It's simply based on the school. But I would also lean on, again, we're compiling questions that ultimately will make good agency of education guidance. And I think this qualifies as one of them, how small schools will be determined.
Mhm. Another question regarding small schools. Has it remained that small schools and small by necessity? Has the preposition changed to the school could be either a small school or small by necessity?
No,
I
the
think
small school to receive the grant is small by necessity.
by necessity. Okay. Then on to independent schools. With regard to the 25% minimum, will independent schools self-report the percentage of publicly funded enrollments, or will a list be provided by the AOE?
AOE.
AOE, okay. Um, is there any tie in H454 as passed to healthcare cost legislation or reform?
There's no direct tie. There was in one draft of H454, a requirement for the Commission on the Future of Public Education to examine the impact of healthcare costs on school districts, but that was removed from the bill.
Okay. Here's a question about the interstate school districts. Will they potentially be required to liquidate?
There is nothing in H454 that would require that. And I believe that it took an act of Congress to form interstate school districts, and it may also take an act of Congress to dissolve an interstate school district.
Okay. Great. A board member has a question that some are concerned that the minimum class size provision could close smaller schools, even if they meet all other EQS education quality standards. Do you have any thoughts about this?
I believe we spoke about a waiver, and that also it's not required that the Secretary of the Agency of Education bring that matter to the state board. It's completely discretionary.
Okay. The next question, could you please highlight whether the $41 million property tax drawdown for fiscal year 26 from the education fund has to fully be paid back by taxpayers in the following year, i.e. fiscal year 27?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, any drawdown money, and this goes for any year, is not guaranteed for the next year. And so it is safe to assume when you're budgeting that that money will need to be covered by taxpayers in the subsequent year.
Okay. I'll come back to these questions, but the person that asked that question about the governance model said that that term came up during the AOE transformation appropriation slide. I do remember it there now, and they appreciated your reply. It clarified it, so thank you. Here's a question about equity. How will equity be ensured for after-school clubs and sports once the lines are drawn and schools are closed?
I want to just say again that there is nothing in 454 besides class size minimums that speaks to school closure at all. In terms of how after school and sports are going to be covered in the foundation formula, I believe it was an assumption when developing the base, but I would have to go back and check on that. And it's certainly a good question for subsequent revisions to the foundation formula in future years.
Do you know that in respect to cell phones, is it the expectation that student athletes will not be allowed to travel with phones? I guess when they're going to sporting events.
One of the exceptions is approval by an administrator for an academic, school-sponsored athletic, or co-curricular purpose for the most limited use reasonably possible. So if it was approved by the administrator, presumably that would be allowed.
If a K through 12 has 120 students, are they no longer small? Oh,
Under this definition in 454, that's correct.
even 101, 101 students, right?
Correct.
Okay. Who will determine what schools will operate in a district?
The school board
Okay.
and voters, presumably.
Debbie,
Yeah.
we also had somebody call, the person with their hand raised for quite a while now had called in with their question. And the question was, how does a community member apply to be on one of the commissions?
Unless they are a former school board member, if we're talking about the task force for redistricting, the qualifications are that you're a former superintendent, a former school board member, or a former business manager. But Sue knows more about the voting ward task force.
The voting ward task force or working group is there are two slots appointed by the Vermont School Boards Association, and we don't have a particular process for those yet because this law just passed on Monday. As far as the boundary task force, I'm not aware of any particular process that's been established yet by the House, the Senate, or the governor for the appointments that will happen to that task force.
Okay, great. Thank you. In H454, is there any discussion of a statewide curriculum or statewide testing?
We have statewide testing currently. I don't, it does not withdraw that requirement. In terms of a statewide curriculum, no, it is not required by H454, though statewide graduation standards are.
Okay. Some towns with very sparse populations send students to a very closely adjacent out-of-state public school. How would sparsity weight apply being the school is out of state?
I do not know the answer to that.
I believe the sparsity weight is based on the school district, not the district or the area that the school is sending its students to.
No, it is based on the city or town in which the school operates in.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that is
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
It is.
Thank you, Chelsea.
No, it was in a previous version. So lots of versions, but it's currently by town or city. Or yeah, town or city.
Back to cell phone requirements. The cell phone requirements are only until dismissal, so sports are an after school generally. Okay. Yeah, so she's basically emphasizing what you said, Sue, earlier.
Yeah,
Yes, that's a good point.
It's a bell-to-bell ban, I believe.
It's bell to bell. Okay. Thank you for that, Sheila. And will there be any funding to schools to follow these mandates?
Well, I did speak about the appropriation to the agency to assist school boards. And I believe that there has been some talk about appropriations in future years if they did have requirements for new school district boundaries.
When are the new school districts expected to be elected and operating? So I think meaning when are the new school districts are going to be established and the new board members will be elected and the districts will then operate?
The districts will be operating on if they go into effect on July 1, 2028.
And school board elections, I believe, are in November 2027.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I have one more question. It's specific. Oh, hold on. One just came in. Looking ahead, has there been any discussion of what to do with the closed schools and how closed schools will impact the towns? Chelsea, I know you just mentioned that there's nothing in the H454 that speaks to closing schools.
No, and I do understand that it's a really important question to have if this were to result in closed schools. And I know it was a topic of discussion quite frequently in the General Assembly. I also met with some communities as well and shared some stories of what repurposed buildings have looked like in other communities. However, once again, just want to stress that 454 does not speak to the operation of schools other than class size minimums.
So I'm going to end with a thank you, an expression of gratitude from someone who said, thank you very much for all your responses and your continued work for the VSBA. And then a question Sue, maybe you could take this one, is how do you think the VSBA might be impacted by H454?
Well, I think initially we're impacted just by the enormity of this bill and understanding it and communicating it to school board members so that you all can participate fully in the democratic process. And beyond that, I certainly think that there are going to be school boards in Vermont that are going to need the valuable services that VSBA offers, which, you know, range from webinars like this to help with orienting your new board members to helping with superintendent evaluations and searches, et cetera. So that's my answer to that question.
Thanks, Sue. All right. Well, I'm going to close us out with a very big thank you to Sue and Chelsea for sharing their knowledge and expertise with all that happened in the legislative session. I know it was a big one and a tough one to follow and stay on top of, and let alone summarize in an hour. So you did a great job, and we really appreciate all your hard work on this webinar. And for anybody who's still on, I just want to let you know that in July, we don't have webinars. Typically, we're hopefully allowing everybody to have some time off to do fun things, but we will be back at it on August 12th at noon. And the topic of our next webinar will be goal setting, planning, and self-assessing. This is help getting us ready for the governance standards under DQS. So thank you everybody very much for participating today. And please don't forget to do the evaluation that should pop up when you sign off. So thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful summer.